and we're off. Cool. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming. This is the third week we've run these. We're going to run a programming chat. In fact, what I will do before I continue to chat is mute everybody. Ooh. Cool. That is everybody muted, and I'm going to make you look at my ugly face so I can spotlight the video. Sorry, not sorry. And I can then still see you all. Cool. So welcome aboard. For those who don't know who I am, my name is Craig Spicer. I have worked in the industry since I was 17. So only maybe 2 years experience now. Everything's going well. I'm not aging a bit. I have my own company, Crazy Strength, for the small group of athletes. I work with the Army, have done for a good 15 years now, heavily involved in the powerlifting and the weightlifting side of things. I have worked for the last 2 or 3 years with Ellico delivering courses as well. My biggest reasons for starting this, I set them up on a Wednesday and on a Sunday, just so that I could get a little bit more communication during the lockdown side of things with the rest of the athletes that I've got on board. It went really well, and the Sunday side of things kind of grew arms and legs, so I suggested to the team that I open it out to the public. This is now the third week. It's been growing and growing. There's lots of interest in attending. Kind of house rules, nice and simple: be open, be honest, listen to everyone else's opinions, ask questions at any point. Don't feel as though you can't ask any questions. What else did I have? The aim for this really is more of a reflective discussion than is anything else. So without further ado, we are going today, there we go, that's better. We are going today to learn about some programming. What I will do is I will call this programming, I'll say part one. I can almost guarantee all of the things that I kind of want to go through with the education side of things with programming. We're probably not going to get through the whole lot. It's such a massive subject that we won't be able to cover everything. But at any point, if you have a question, it should enable you to unmute your mic. If you've got a question, feel free to ask it. Just interject as you go. Myself and Dean will go through. So Dean has helped me very much in the last couple of episodes as well. So Dean will cover a couple of bits as well. That doesn't mean we haven't got lots of experienced coaches. I've got brothers from over the seas as well. Carlton, good to see you jumping in. I'll give you a nice little wave as well. I've got loads of good coaches that I already know are in. So weightlifting coaches. My coach was here a minute ago. I think he's still here. There he is. Give us a wave, Christian. He's not even going to wave at me. Oh, there he is. And I've got some decent powerlifting coaches in the group as well. Weightlifting coaches with the Army and with powerlifting and weightlifting. So there's lots of experience to be brought to the table. From a programming perspective, I chatted to Dean earlier. We look to talk through similar things. So we'll talk broad brush more than anything. I know there's a couple of areas I particularly want to use as discussion pieces, which means I'll probably be unmuting all the mics and getting opinions from you guys. So without further ado, I'm not going to give the 7 key stages that we go through programming. I'm going to let Dean do that in a minute. I'm probably going to cover the first couple, and then Dean can summarize those first couple and then go into the next few. I don't know whether we'll have a chance to go through all 7 today. There might be a couple left off, but we'll certainly cover a lot of it. So the best way to start, I was kind of racking my brains on how to actually start this discussion, because it is such a broad brush, such a big subject. I found the best way to cover it was to look at coming off the back of our motivation discussion. Most of our motivation discussion last week was mainly looking at goal setting and how to stay motivated whilst going through the lockdown side of things. It also was pertinent to outside the lockdown side of things, but obviously the situation that we have is now, so it was quite nice to talk about that. But goal setting and the setting of goals, how to do them, why to do them, that came up from there. So that draws us on to the programming side of things. And the first thing that I kind of look to do is to look at a fact-finding mission of the what's and the whys. So what are you after? Why are you doing it? What programming do you need? What is the goal? And the goal could be many different things. The biggest thing that I look at from programming, and this I'm sure will be in agreement from most of the people that have spent a good time programming, is looking at reverse engineering what that program is, so the timescale that you've got, and you work back from there depending on what the goal is. So your macro cycle, which is your big picture, is your end goal, and your reverse engineering from there, looking at each of those meso and micro cycles underneath. So you've got the long-term goal, the different medium-term and short-term goals as you go through there and building up. So you're going to have to look at structuring it in that way. Consultation tends to happen. All good PTs will have some kind of consultation process. I know anyone I've worked with and anyone that I have worked under has had a consultation process, which kind of encompasses that fact-finding mission. So we look at things like, what is your biological and what is your training age, whether that be specific or non-specific. So I know pertinent, probably both to powerlifters for me and for weightlifters, but you look at a lot of kids coming through these days have got really good experience in the gymnastics side of things. So that would, for me, for powerlifting and weightlifting, is a really good example of a non-specific training age that can be transitioned over to that side of things. So that sort of thing needs to be taken into account as well when you look to program. Training age, obviously you get kids coming through, and I will suggest that supplementation can bring out advantageous training ages, but I'll stick to what we know. Geography athletes, everyone here as far as I'm aware is a geography athlete, and I would have it in no other way. So we look at your training age with the youth that can generally recover much more because hormonally they are driven to recover in that way. We have our standards kind of, certainly in the powerlifting and the weightlifting side of things, what we term as the open categories, and then we have our master categories, which generically tend to be programmed slightly differently. Unfortunately, in about 10 years time, will start coming to those master ages and all my hormones will start dissipating, but we'll wait for a while because obviously I'm still only 19. So what we do need to be looking at doing when we first start to program is, once we've got the goals, we need to understand where they're at. So there should be some kind of batch testing, some kind of protocol. Now, if that's an athlete that you're working with sport specific, now obviously I refer mainly to the weightlifting and the powerlifting side of things. That could be any sport. So that could be, I think Dean and I chatted earlier, that could be bobsleigh, that could be a sprinter, that could be any sport. You would need to have some batch of testing. Obviously, the most specific tests you have are the sport itself. So if I have a powerlifter, I'm looking at their 1 rep max back squat. If I'm looking at a weightlifter, you look at their clean and their jerk and their snatch. But you also have non-specific tests, and that will depend upon the athlete that you have, their requirements, their needs, and their weaknesses. Obviously, we'll take that into account as we go through. So what else do we need to take into account? I think I have covered most of the bits I need to cover, so I shall mute myself.
Perfect. So, Craig, is that you handing over? I can't really tell. Have you unmuted? Yeah, I can't hear you, mate. Good. Okay, guys. So, after speaking with Craig earlier on, I by no means stretch of the imagination profess to be the best at doing this. I just have experiences and lots of different walks of life that have allowed me to learn, understand the fundamentals of programming for different athletes, especially from a strength and conditioning perspective. And Chris Williams, for example, a mentor of mine who's guided me through my weightlifting process, has made a huge sort of dent in my understanding and my learning of weightlifting. But my original background was from an S&C perspective. So I figured it'd be pertinent to sort of give you an idea of where I start with my athletes and my clients and anybody that comes to me from whichever background they come from. So Craig already alluded to it with regards to the client and the onboarding and the assessment process. Now I break that process down into 4 very distinct phases. And I think, is Susie on the call? I think Susie is. Susie, I sent a few pictures last week to her. And that kind of breaks that system down and gives you an understanding about how you, as a coach or even as an athlete, can gauge a better understanding of what a coach is trying to do when they're establishing the initial strategies and initial starting points for your program. So with a client assessment phase, we start with the who you are. And Craig alluded to that when we refer to the training age, when we look at things like your biological age, we look at your history of training. We can even stem as far back and look at what your experiences are, your skill level, like transferable motor skills that you've had with gymnastics, for example. They all cross reference into weightlifting and powerlifting in some way, shape, or form. Now, I take a very mixed modal approach when it comes to training, which is what I'm probably more renowned for. If you want weightlifting programming and things like that, then there's no better people in this room than the likes of Craig, Chris Williams, Gary Jackson, Christian, and Bestie. You know, there's some great athletes and great coaches in here that have got such a wide array of experience that they're the people that I would go to for weightlifting. But when it comes to mixed modal, I put myself in that position because that's something that I love and I have done for a long time. So once we figured out the who, the next thing we need to then decipher as you as the athlete or the coach is the wants and the needs. And this can be broken down into a number of different things, but we need to understand, even if you are the athlete, you need to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, and we need to come to a common goal when it comes to programming. And this is where Craig mentioned the reverse engineering of the process. And it's such an important thing, because if that communicative pathway isn't created, then the program then can't be structured in the right way with macro, meso, and micro cycles. For those of you that are into performance-based sports, will have a full understanding of what I'm referring to. And let's take Joe, for example. Joe, you hopefully won't mind me saying this, as a bobsleigh athlete. Somebody like her is very, very dependable on a competitive season, and a program for bobsleighing would have different ramifications if it was not structured in the right way. So it's got to be geared appropriately towards the sport that you're taking part in. Or even if it's functional based training and it's just for recreational ability, there should still be some sort of common goal that we want to try and get to. Now, the next process we then look at is the direction. So what direction do we need to take in order to get to that common goal? So that will be that simple thing we spoke about if you were with us last week, where we looked at plotting the tree. What are those small hanging fruits that we can do within our program that allow us to reach those highest hanging fruits? And if you remember, we spoke about goal setting in the fact that a lot of us have tended to in the past rely on the destination rather than the processes that we put in place to get us to that destination and that journey that we want to take. And then the final phase that we'd look at is then identifying this new pathway and this new identity that we want to create in developing you and developing all those processes. And that's where the 7-step process then takes effect, because we've done the onboarding and we've done the client assessment process, where we looked at things like movement mechanics. Particularly if you're a weightlifter, overhead squatting is a great functional movement assessment that we can do, because it elicits lots of different bits of information that we can use as a coach to then program you going forward. And I take this saying from, I picked this up from Chris, and this is something that has sort of stuck with me ever since the day I think I met him when he spoke about this, Chris Williams. And it's about fixing the problem and that problem alone before we then break into other avenues. So say, for example, in that movement assessment, we find that you have an issue overhead. We've got to fix that instability before we can then look at progressing further within a program. And if you're the athlete and you don't have coaches at your disposal for programming, then look at your just simple self-reflecting videos that allow you to look at your overhead squat. It could be a plank. It could even be something specific to your sport, sprinting, for example. Look at those small inadequacies and these intricate details, find out if there's an issue, and fix and reverse engineer that issue. And that's something that I've taken away, certainly from lots of people in my time of coaching and dealing with the onboarding process of programming. So the 7-step process, I don't know if we are likely to get through the whole of this 7-step process. I think Craig will hopefully be able to back me up on this, but it all starts with the needs analysis. We need to look at you, and this is number one. So if you've got a notebook and pen and you want to write this down, brilliant. So number one is the needs analysis. We've got to know what you need as the athlete. If you're a powerlifter, it's highly unlikely you need to be spending 7 to 10 hours on a road bike each week, digging out blind in an endurance-based sport. That's not going to serve you. It may do in some respect, but it's not going to serve you in the long run.
If you do, you're out.
So it's really important that we understand as coaches and as athletes what the needs of your sport require. and we look at weightlifting. We understand weightlifting requires explosive strength. It requires speed. It requires reaction. It requires power. And then you can reverse engineer that process and build the program accordingly. What else comes with the needs analysis? We build the requirements and the characteristics of your sport. So what typical characteristics do we have as sprinters, for example? We look at things like developing rate of force development, fast stretch shortening cycle. We look at things like fast twitch muscle fibers, trying to recruit more of those. We look at explosive based movements, plyometric training. So there's lots of different things, but it's not identifying the protocols we're going to use. It's identifying what characteristics the athlete has. Craig, do you want to add anything on the needs analysis, or even any of the coaches?
I've done the needs analysis already. I'm happy you move on, mate.
Okay, so the next thing we look at is number 2, which is exercise selection and movement protocols. So within that, I sort of made some brainstorm notes. So I will be looking down just to sort of recap. But what movement patterns should you be developing as an athlete? Now, that could be a whole host of different things. It could be a mixed model of movement patterns, a mixed model of training, lots of different components and lots of different moving parts. And it's important for you as an athlete and as a coach to understand that those components are what build the starting blocks and the foundation of our program going forward. And more importantly, do they relate to what you need and what you want as an athlete? Because otherwise, what's the point? You're not going to enjoy it. It's probably not something that you're going to do adhering to it and stay consistent to it. So why would we select exercise and movement protocols that you wouldn't necessarily want to do? And I think Craig alluded, and I alluded to this yesterday or this evening on the phone. Like, if you've got a powerlifter that hates doing sets of 8, 4 different or 6 sets of 8, for example, why give them 6 sets of 8 if it's going to decrease their adherence? You know, and that's just a very, very simple example.
Yeah, that'll come up a little bit later down the line. That.
Yeah, and are there little things that we can play to within our strengths that still allow us to increase whatever component of fitness we're looking at? So I think Glenn put his hand up there. I don't know if he hates sets of 8 from previous programming. So it'd be a good start.
I'm sure a hand up means more.
So the other thing we need to look at with exercise selection and movement protocols is what midline and assistant exercises are we incorporating into our program. And I call these, and Craig laughed at me earlier on, but they are corrective fundamental movements. So the reason I say that they're corrective fundamental movements is because a lot of people don't like doing prehab work. They don't like working on the small, intricate details. They don't like spending time associated with just doing things, for example, banded external rotations or single leg glute bridges or
single leg bridges, Mr.
McLean. Lots of different things. The list goes on, but people don't like doing those small things. So is there a way that we can encompass that into a program with the movement protocols and exercise selection, and they just make up assistant exercises at the end of your workout, but they're not too taxing or they detract from the adherence of the program? So that's something else that we would need to consider. And it goes back to that biggest point that Chris said before. Me and Chris have spoke about in the past. Fix those imbalances. It's no use going any further in the program if we do not fix those imbalances. So
the best reference there, if I can just interject 2 seconds.
Yeah, go.
The same as looking at a doctor. If you go to a doctor with a headache, they'll just give you a paracetamol rather than actually treating the cause of what is causing the headaches. So as a programming process, you need to understand what exactly is causing these issues and deal with that, rather than just going, if the joint's hurting, he's probably not strong enough, so we're just going to give him loads of back squats. So it's treating the cause rather than the symptoms.
Exactly that. And like I said, I think a lot of us in here have probably learned the hard way. Dare I say, looking at the seasoned athletes and veterans amongst us in here, Chris, Gary, lots of other guys, I'm sure will vouch for me and say that they had wished that they had spent those times fixing those issues many, many moons ago, because it does have some reflection later on in life and it does play its part later on down the program. So we need to fix them early, get them sorted there and then, and build and then progress as we go through. So phase 3 is training frequency. How often and how many sessions do you need as an athlete to progress? The big question in the fitness industry. It depends. It completely depends. It depends on your physiological age. It depends on your training age. Depends on how susceptible you are to that training load and whatever it may be. But more importantly, it's about enjoying the process. I'm not going to give somebody a 7-day-a-week program, 2 sessions a day, if it's going to affect their adherence, and it's going to affect them in the long run when we look at the overload principle, for example, or the progressive model. So with that in mind, we need to be very mindful about the training frequency that we need as a minimum, for example, with a powerlifter. Now that might be 2 or 3 sessions a week, but if you want to reach the top level, dare I say it, I don't think 2 or 3 sessions a week is going to cut the mustard. So you've got to then look at how much you want to need the things that we're talking about. So anything else on training frequency? Craig, Chris,
No,
Gary, or anyone add anything?
If at any point anyone wants to add anything, ask a question, just unmute your mic, crack on.
Just one from me, not really a question. I've got to cut out now, but thanks again for the invite. And I'm pretty sure I heard Dean say at least twice in that last thing that the athlete should enjoy their exercises. So Craig, if I see fucking
That'll be a no. Love you, bye. Bye. Good year.
Bye now.
Brilliant. Oh, someone's got music on. Okay, so number four for me and Craig, and this is nothing that's hidden. This is all accessible information. Number 4 is exercise order. Now, when we talk about exercise order, prioritizing the main aims of a session or the main aims of a particular micro or meso cycle. So for example, if I want to develop or increase my maximal strength in the back squat, for example, it wouldn't make sense me doing some sort of capacity work or conditioning work before I then do the back squat. That's just a simple analogy and a simple thing to refer to. So when we talk about priorities as a coach and an athlete, we need to look at what's going to give us the biggest bang for buck. We look at studies that reflect on power, strength, speed, and speed strength, and incorporating very explosive mechanical movements that are going to help us when it comes to developing maximal strength and recruiting more muscle fibers. So things like that we can consider within a program that's going to allow us to layer the program progressively. We then need to look at what model we're going to use within that exercise order. If you are a power lifter, do you potentially follow a push-pull alternate routine? Do you follow a lower-upper split? Do you follow simple things like supersets and compounds? As a weightlifter, weightlifting, the principles and the fundamentals that we follow, simple things like technical-based movements. We then look at a derivative of the lift and then a strength-based exercise. But in what order can we get those in with regards to what the athlete is able to do and where they're currently at with their training? So that brings us on to number 5. Number 5 is training load and reps. So when we talk about training load is completely different to volume of training. And that's something to be very mindful of. So training load, which is number 5, we are talking about percentages based on RMs. So what work are we doing with regard to those percentages if we have that information available to us?
Cool.
And we can look at things like variation of load and progression over time. So other things that we can look at as well is reverse engineering those macro cycles and ensuring the training load that we're given isn't causing too many issues with that individual athlete. Oh, we've got a question coming.
It's all right. I'm dealing with that as you're talking. I'm going to take over in a second, though.
Yeah, cool. I'll finish these last 2. So number 6 brings us on to volume of training. Now, volume of training is an accrued amount of sets and reps that allow us to increase the total amount of volume within a program or within a given micro or mesocycle. So if I wanted to increase the amount of volume that an individual athlete is lifting, we could look at lots of different models, cluster sets, multiple sets, drop sets. You can look at things like tempo, etc., etc. There's so many different variables and modalities that you can look at but we need to understand what phase of training or what phase of program we're in for that adaptation to it. So what are we looking at? Are we looking at building muscle hypertrophy? Are we looking at developing power? Are we looking at developing maximal strength, endurance? And that will reflect the volume that we're going to be using as well. And then finally, number 7 is the rest periods. And Craig will come on to the prescriptions and stuff shortly, but we spoke about rest periods before. And when we look at programming, each given rest period allows us to follow a different principle of training. So when you look at things like strength, or you're looking at developing maximal strength, more often than not, coaches will prescribe things like 2 to 5 or 3 to 5 minutes of rest. Now, when it comes down to endurance-based work, or we're looking to build capacity in some way, shape, or form, we're obviously going to lower that rest and the percentages at the same time. So that's sort of a holistic view of some guidelines to follow in terms of the 7-step process that will hopefully help you either build your model, or as an athlete, potentially understand the processes that people go through. And it's not as simple as, oh, can I get a program? And how many times, I'm sure the coaches all look in here and smile. People are smiling now, but, oh, can you write me a program to get my squat better? It doesn't work like that. There's so many different things, and I'll probably lost count myself. I dread to think how many people in here have lost count of people asking them, can you write me a squat program? Can you write me this or that? There's so many different things that we've got to consider.
It's not as simple as that if it's done well.
7-step process. Yes, exactly. And if it's done properly, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go back to I think 6 was volume, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So 6 is probably one of the areas that I go, you know what, that probably deserves its own kind of session itself. So things like, and we'll touch on a few different types of programming. So looking at linear programming, conjugate method, daily, weekly undulating programming, wave loading, and all that sort of stuff. We'll touch on that briefly, but that's probably got its own kind of session written all over it. In fact, I will put myself back on. Dean, I'll leave your mic off for now, mate. So
no worries,
I'll leave it on. I'll leave it on, mate. You just jump in when we need to. I don't want to just see my face. There we go. Now I can see everyone. And it's things like I will kind of draw on people like Christian, hopefully in the forthcoming weeks, to look at things like his examples of programming and the different styles of programming that can be utilized, looking at beginner levels, looking at peaking and tapering for competitions and things like that. That's definitely got its own episode written all over it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the kind of sets and reps side of things. What I don't want to do is patronize anyone, but I am going to, if I can find it, I'm going to dig out a picture for you to look at.
Guys, while Craig's doing that, has anybody got any not questions, but does anybody, even the coaches in this group, want to add any information about what we've gone through there? I don't think it very much varies.